Well, welcome back. It's great to see all your bright and shining faces. At least I can see them in my imagination, and hope you're doing well. We're in Luke chapter 11 still, and we've gotten to the section of Luke now where Jesus is confronting the Pharisees. And we talked some about that last week, but the confrontations continue, and they go through the rest of his life up until the very end when he's crucified. And it's primarily the Pharisees, although he does have some interactions with the Sadducees and others. So in Luke chapter 11, starting in verse 37, and as he, Jesus, spoke, a certain Pharisee besought him to dine with him, and he went in and sat down to eat. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. Okay, now you get the picture. This Pharisee asked you to come to his house for dinner. Okay, fine. Jesus goes. Comes in the house. I don't know what the customs were. I don't know if they shook hands or hugged or whatever they did, but they came into the house and they sat down to the meal, and Jesus doesn't wash his hands. Now, the word in verse 38 that is translated in English and King James at least as washed is the word baptism. It's the same word that's translated baptism. It's not the word for washing your clothes or something. This is the word. It means then, as you know from baptism, it means a ceremonial process, a ceremonial act that you go through. And, Christian baptism is not to clean your body. It is a symbolic act and so on. And that's what the Pharisee's thinking about. He's not thinking about, this poor guy's been out in the hot sun all day and his hands are dirty and he needs to wash his hands before he eats. That's not what's going on. It's not like sending your 8-year-old to go wash his hands. You've been playing in the mud all morning. This is a ceremonial washing that the Pharisees went through, and it's not, I don't know for sure why they did this. It was a very long time ago, but some think that what was going on was they were saying, look, we've been out in the world all day, and as you know in the Old Testament law, there's a whole series of unclean and clean animals. Unclean animals, and insects and flies and so on were unclean. And so it's very possible as they were going through the day that they may have touched a fly, had a fly landing on their hand. They might have had some other contact with something that was considered unclean. And so they were going to wash themselves ceremoniously purify themselves before they ate, because they didn't want to have an unclean hand because it had been touched by whatever. And then they would transfer that uncleanness to their food and then transfer it to their mouth, and you get the picture. That's not required by the Old Testament law. That's nowhere in the Old Testament law. This is something that they had developed or made up and added to the law. But as far as this Pharisee and other Pharisees were concerned, this was absolutely essential. If you didn't do this, then you were eating unclean food. And remember, the whole point of the dietary restrictions in the Old Testament law was that some foods were clean and some foods were unclean. Remember also, there's no reason at all to think that there's any dietary advantages, any nutritional or health advantages to keeping the Old Testament diet. I know once in a while I'll find somebody that says that or writes that, but that doesn't make any sense, because those same restrictions were not placed on the church. And if one thinks that those dietary restrictions in the Old Testament were to protect the Israelites, then why weren't they transferred to the church? Did God love the Israelites more than he loves the church? And so it doesn't make any sense. So that was not their function. The function of those Old Testament dietary restrictions was, God said, you are going to be different than the people around you. Circumcision, diet, the way you dress, the way you act. You're going to be distinct. You're going to stand out. You're going to be weird. You're going to be different than people around you, and your dietary restrictions are part of that. And so the Pharisees were trying to prevent, through their own imaginations, not because God had told them to, were trying to prevent making themselves unclean, defiling themselves by cleaning their hands, ceremoniously washing their hands before they ate. And it says that the Pharisee was astounded. It says marveled, as King James, what the King James uses. He was astounded that here's this man who claims to be from God, and in fact does signs and wonders that must have come from God. Where else could they have come from? And yet when he comes to eat, he does not keep the law. Now remember, at the time Jesus was alive, if a person did not keep the law, they could not claim that they were obedient to God. They could not claim that they truly loved God with all their soul, all their mind, all their heart. They didn't. They had to keep the law. And as far as the Pharisees were concerned, this business of ceremoniously cleansing your hands before you ate was as much a part of the law as thou shalt not kill. was not contained in, remember, the Pharisees held the position that in addition to the written law that's contained in the books of the Old Testament, there was also an oral law that had to be kept too. And they had, in Jesus' time, they had begun at least to codify that oral law. It had not been written down yet, as far as we know. It wasn't for a couple hundred years later that this started being written down. But they had added all of these interpretations, all of these explanations, all of these additions to the law that God had given them, because they thought there must be more to this than what's here. And this business of washing hands before you ate was part of that. And so the Pharisee was judging Jesus because he did not wash his hands. And since he didn't wash his hands before he ate, he was potentially eating unclean food, and therefore he was not keeping the law, and therefore how could he possibly be from God if he didn't keep the law? Now you can find that same argument to this day. If you look at Jewish, traditional, Orthodox Jewish writings about Jesus and about what the Messiah is going to be and so on, that same idea is still out there. And that's what he's thinking. Well, now, if you read what happened, we're going to read it, but we look at what happens next. Jesus goes off on this guy and on those that are with him. Now, remember, Jesus is a guest in the house. He's not eating in a public place. He hasn't invited the Pharisee to his house. The Pharisees invited him to his house, to the Pharisee's house, and Jesus is a guest. And look what he says. He just goes off. The Lord said unto him, this is verse 39, now do you Pharisees make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but your inward part is full of ravening and wickedness. Now that word ravening is important in this context because that word ravening has the idea of extortion, of robbery, of theft. And that comes in later. So he says, verse 40, you fools, did not he that made that which is without, referring of course to God, make that which is within also? Now, again, he's talking in this man's house, and these are not gentle, these are not kind, these are not diplomatic. This is just right in your face. He calls them fools to their faces. He says, look, you care about the outside. You wash your hands, in this context, you wash your hands in order to prevent even the slightest possibility that you might contaminate yourself or make yourself unclean because you're eating food that's been contaminated because your hands touched something that's unclean, so on and so forth. Nothing about that in the law that God gave, but they added it to that. It's the same idea as you looked at when you talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan, when the Levite and the priest crossed over the other side of the pathway in order to avoid this guy because they did not want to become ceremoniously unclean. Same idea. He says, you clean the outside. You're all worried about the outer appearance. You're all worried about making sure your hands are not somehow contaminated and that therefore you contaminate the food you eat. He said, but you don't look, verse 40, you fools. Didn't the God that made your outside body also make what you are? Is not your mind and your will and your emotions and your thought patterns, were they not made by the same God that made your outside, that made your hands and your skin? If you're so concerned about keeping your hands and your skin clean, why in the world are you not equally concerned about the inner parts, about the emotions and the will and the actions and the attitudes and the thoughts and so on that God also made? He goes on then in verse 41 and says, but rather give alms of such things as ye have, and behold, all things are clean unto you. The word clean has the connotation of pure. Now, why does he tell them, give alms? Why does he say, if you want to be pure? Now, remember, the context is washing your hands and making the outside of the skin clean so that you don't somehow defile yourself by what you eat. But why does he then say, well, give of what you have, and then you'll be pure, then you'll be clean? Well, it goes back to that word ravening. That word ravening, he accuses them of being thieves. He accuses them of being extortioners, of robbery. Now, this is Jesus the Christ speaking. He knew what he was talking about. If he called those people thieves, then they were thieves. No question about it. This wasn't me or you making something up. He knew. And he uses the word specifically to highlight the fact that somehow, somewhere, I don't know when, I don't know how, the Bible doesn't tell us, but at some point they were involved in extortion, in theft. And so he says, in order to undo that, in order to be clean on the inside, you need to give away what you've amassed. The implication being that the wealth you've amassed has been amassed by taking advantage of other people through extortion, through outright robbery, through theft. He mentions this same idea in some other passages. But he says, so the idea is you've amassed this wealth illegally, if you will, in violation of being pure and holy and righteous, and you need to give it back. You need to give it away. And if you'll give it away, if you'll start giving instead of taking, then you'll be pure. Then he goes on in verse 42. But woe unto you, Pharisees. And the idea of woe there has the idea of damnation. Woe unto you, Pharisees. For you tithe mint and rue and all manners of herbs. Now, what's he talking about? Well, remember, the Israelites were to tithe. In fact, if you read the Old Testament law carefully, you'll find they were to give 3 tithes, or they were to set aside 3 tithes. One of those tithes went to the temple, or went to the tabernacle, went to the priest. And so he's saying, you tithe all this stuff in your garden. Remember, this is an agrarian society. They didn't have the Walmarts or the Krogers. They grew a lot of things. He says, you actually go through all the herbs in your garden. I don't know if you grow herbs or not, but I grow some oregano and stuff. But they said, you go through here and you look at your mint, and you from which mint you grew, and you take 1/10 of that and give it. Or you sell it and give the money. I'm not sure which. And you do the same thing for rue, which is another type of flavorful herb. You do this of these minor little things that just grow. You probably didn't even plant them. They're perennials. They just grew every year. But every year, God blesses you, and these plants grow. And so you go out there and you carefully measure out 1/10 of that and give that. He says, that's what he's talking about. So he's talking about you're going to minute detail, implying way more than really necessary. But you go to minute detail to make sure that you're giving the tithe that you're commanded to give. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over, ignore, forget about, just sort of skip over the business of judgment, of being just and honest, and the love of God. Said, these you ought to have done. Okay, it's good that you're tithing these things. That's, you're being very, very careful, and that's fine, that's good. But you can't leave the others, and not to leave the other undone. You can't say that because I tithe of the herbs in my garden, I'm righteous, when your actions and your deeds and your inner thoughts are contrary to what God says, and that you don't even have a basic understanding of the love of God. You don't love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, which he says is the foundation of which the law is built. You don't go there. Instead, you're focused entirely on these outward things. You go to great lengths to make sure that you've obeyed the law when it comes to these outward things, but inward, what you are, as he said earlier, you're filthy. Your inward part's filthy. He goes on, woe unto you, Pharisees, for you love the uppermost seats in the synagogues and greeting in the markets. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you have graves which appear not, and the men that walk over them are not aware of them. See what he's saying? You want man's adulation. You covet the spotlight. You want the praise and honor. You want the best seat in the house, in the synagogue. You want people to greet you. You want people to know you, to acknowledge you in the marketplace. As you walk around, you want people to think, oh, there's a holy person. There's a sanctified, there's a pure person. This is a Pharisee. He's special. He's extraordinarily good. Look how careful he is. He weighs out the herbs that grow in his garden, and he gives 1/10 of them. Look what a great person this is, how honoring he is to God, and how righteous and holy he is. So that's what you're after. You crave the adulation of humans, of men, of people. You want them to recognize you. He says in verse 44, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You're hypocrites. You try to look good on the outside. You go to great lengths to make sure that people think you are wonderful, and you love it. You live for that. You live for the adulation they give you and for the honor they bestow upon you because you're so righteous and holy. But you're a hypocrite. He says, what truth is, you're graves. You're full of dead people's bones. And people don't even know it. He said, people don't even realize that they're in a graveyard when they're around you. They think you're wonderful because you look wonderful on the outside and do all these things. But in reality, inwardly, you're just diseased and you're foul and filthy, and people encounter you and think they're coming in contact with someone who's clean and holy, but the truth is they're coming in contact with somebody who's dead, who's decayed, rotten, filthy. Now, notice this. The reason for this response had to do with the fact that he didn't go through the ceremonial washing process that they expected a holy person to go through. That ceremonial washing process was something that they had added to God's law. It was not part of God's law. They had added it. But in their minds, it was equal. It was equivalent. It was the same. It was a part of God's law just as much as thou shalt not commit adultery. And so if you didn't wash your hands before you ate, then you were not a holy, righteous person. You were not someone that God would honor. You were not honoring God. You were disobedient. Now look, I don't think it's near as big a problem in churches like ours as it was a few decades ago. But it's not at all uncommon for us to do much the same thing. To make up these extra rules. If you do this or go here or listen to that or dress like this or whatever, then you can't possibly be a good Christian. You can't possibly be a Christian. And and ostracize people who don't live up to this Christian norm, this good testimony norm that has been established. It's not in the Bible. Now, again, I'm not talking about rebellious disobedience with God's instructions. That's under the ballgame, a whole nother thing. I'm talking about, as you are well aware, I don't think it's as common as it was, but a few decades ago, it was real common for churches to have all these unwritten expectations of how you would live and how you would act and how you would talk and where you would go and how you would dress and so on and so forth. And if you didn't do those things, then you couldn't possibly be a good Christian, and maybe you weren't even a believer at all. That's exactly the same thing the Pharisees were doing. It's exactly the same thing, adding our own ideas, our own preferences, our own to what God had said. That's what Romans 14 is all about. Don't do that. Limit yourself. If you are going to discern right from wrong, you limit yourself to what God said. You don't make additions to it. You say, well, what about some? Wait a minute. Every believer is a child of God. The Holy Spirit is within them. The Holy Spirit leads them. Hey, if they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, God's going to take care of that. I don't need to be pointing fingers and judging them on the basis of some external thing that is not contained in the Bible, that I've sort of made up or that I think or that is my preference. I don't need to do it. God will take care of that. If they're disobeying him, if they're living a life that he disapproves of, he will discipline them. He will take care of them. They're his child. They're not mine. As Paul says, they're God's servant. He's perfectly capable of managing them. Paul doesn't say it in those words, but that's the gist of what he says. He's perfectly capable of taking care of them. I don't need to do it for him. Now, if someone's living in rebellious disobedience to God's instructions, and as a church, churches are instructed to deal with that. But I'm not talking about those issues. I'm talking like the Pharisee was talking about this extra thing of washing your hands before you ate that had nothing to do with God's law. Again, there is no point in focusing on the externals. There's no point in it. It doesn't accomplish anything. Now, again, I'm not talking about your children or maybe your parents. I'm not talking about that. That's a different issue. Yes, you are expected to train up your child in the way they should go. You're expected to raise your children in nurture and admonition of the Lord. And yes, you're going to have rules and expectations as long as they live in your household under your, eating your food and living in your house. You can. That's perfect. That's not the issue here. The issue is when I go to other people and expect them to live according to what I think is right and wrong, even though God doesn't say any such thing. It's exactly the same thing the Pharisees did. And in fact, it is setting myself, when I do that, I'm setting myself up as God, that I get to determine the moral standards. No, I don't get to determine the moral standards. Only God gets to do that. And so there's not a whole lot of point in focusing on externals. And that's what Jesus is telling these men. And they were all men because they were all Pharisees, and Pharisees were all men. You're focused on your externals. You're completely ignoring. You're robbers, extortioners. You're completely ignoring loving God even. These external things you're doing are not something you're doing because you love God, because you care about what he thinks of you, because you wish to be obedient to him. These external things you're doing are because you want to be recognized in public. You want people to look up to you. You want people to praise you. You want to be honored for being so wonderful. And the truth is, you're nothing. In fact, you're worse than nothing. You're robbers. You're liars. You're like graves full of dead, filth, rotten. You just have. you've focused on the externals and you've forgotten about what really matters, and as a result of that, you're complete hypocrites. You're hypocrites. You're looking like something you're not. We'll close with the next thing. Look at verse 45 now. Remember, he's saying this in someone's house at the dinner table. Not exactly what we would call polite dinner conversation. Then answered one of the lawyers. Now remember, the lawyers were they were lawyers because they were involved in interpreting and understanding and translating for the masses the law. Not the Roman law, not the civil law, but the law of God that he'd given him. And they had added all these things. And so one of the lawyers says unto him, Master, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. Who, me? You're accusing me of these things? Don't you know who I am? I'm a lawyer. I'm a person who has devoted his adult life into understanding and interpreting and applying the law. And you're accusing, when you say these things, he's being polite. But he's saying, you're accusing me of these things? You're reproaching us also. And Jesus says in verse 41, woe unto you also, ye lawyers, for you load men with burdens, grievous to be borne, and you yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers. It says, yeah, you're in the same group because you make up these rules and you expect other people to obey them. And you pile this burden on them that's impossible to bear. And remember, Jesus said, come to me for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's contrasting his love, his concern, his way with what they're doing. He says, you throw all this stuff at people and you yourself are not going to lift one finger to do it. You're a complete hypocrite. He goes on and says, well, you build sepulchres for the prophets. Well, that's nice. Here's a tomb, of Isaiah, and here's one for Jeremiah, and here's one for Zechariah, and here's one for whoever. We've got these monuments to these dead people. Well, that, you build the tombs, you decorate them, you make them look nice. And he says, you build it to sepulchres of the prophets, and your fathers killed them. You are descended from the false prophets, is what he's telling them, what he's saying. You're descended from the false prophets that are common throughout the Old Testament, especially in the latter parts of the reign of Israel. And you find lots and lots of admonitions and so on, and stories about them in the book of Jeremiah and so on. You're descended from those false prophets. Your fathers, your forefathers, the people that you are descended, whether physically or more philosophically or educate, whatever you want to use, you descended from them. Your fathers killed you. You're building these nice tombs, but the truth is you're in the same boat. It was your families, people that think like you and act like you and talk like you, that were responsible for killing them. Now, again, that's prophetic in some sense because they were going to kill him too. He knew that. I don't know if they knew that at this point, but he knew it. And he says, your fathers, you build these great tombs, but hey, all you're doing is acknowledging the fact that your people like you were responsible for their deaths. Well, we need to stop there, so we'll stop there. We'll continue with this passage next week and go on through the rest of his conversation, you want to call it that, with the Pharisees and the lawyers at this dinner table. And then in the last few verses of the chapter, we see what their response was. Ultimately, know what their response was. They hated him. They despised him because of the way he talked to them, because he refused to honor them as they wanted, because he refused to acknowledge that their way was correct, and ultimately that's what they killed him.